I'm coming for you, John. You're the theme of our lesson today. We're talking about rejected. No, I just had to get my beeper, my buttony thingy. Sometimes we leave it all over the place. Rejection is a hard thing. You know, I'm sure John's stomach was turning over even when he thought I was, even though he knows that I'm a joker. Rejection is a hard thing, and it starts off when we're kids, We don't get picked for tag or hide and seek, or we don't get picked for football, or we don't get, picked for prom, or we don't, there's just so many things that we get rejected by. We learn rejection early. And so Paul has been taking great pains to assure us that we can trust in God not to reject us. But then he's had this problem, because it sounds like, and it looked like to him, that God had rejected the Jews. And he had to puzzle that through. Can God be trusted if he's rejecting the Jews? Well, he turns around and he decides God hasn't rejected the Jews. He has always been faithful to his promises. He has always been the same yesterday, today, forever, as the verse we just sang there. Jesus Christ, still the same. We can trust in our Savior because he is still the same. He is trustworthy. He did not reject the Jews. He always lived according to his promises. It was just our problem because we did not understand what those promises were. Way back in chapter 9, verse 6, Paul has been starting this issue of what to do about the Jews. What does the Bible say? And it's all a matter of faithfulness. Can we trust God in our own life if we can't trust God for what he did there? Now, Paul has spent the last couple chapters explaining what those promises did not mean. They did not mean that everybody in Israel was going to be saved. There never was a blanket promise that every Israelite, every physical descendant of Abraham would go to heaven. And he had been at great pains to explain that to us. God is free to choose only some of the Jews. He is also free to choose some of the Gentiles. He is free to do this. He acts only in accordance with his character. And that means that he can do what he wants. Paul then spent 2 chapters explaining that. And that's what we've been covering the last several months as we've been looking at what Paul has been trying to say. God did not promise. Exactly what did he promise? Well, now he's going to get into what God did promise. I don't know what that sign means. Somebody probably does. YCHICYFCFTRFTDDS. We're going to explain what God's promise means. That's what Paul does here in chapter 11. He brackets this chapter with some reassurances. In the second verse, he promises them that God did not reject his people. He foreknew them. He has not rejected. At the end of the chapter, in verse 28, he says the Israelites are loved. God brackets this. Now, he says what it didn't mean. It didn't mean that every Israelite would be saved, but he says that, yes, the Jews are God's chosen people, and they are loved by God. Now, a significant break occurs in this chapter. This whole chapter is about what God did promise. But there's a break in the middle between 10 and 11. That's why we're only doing the first 10 verses this morning. In the first part of this, or in this chapter, he unfolds his teaching about God's enduring faithfulness in 2 stages. Now, last chapter, in chapter 9, he told us what God did in the past. Now, in this chapter, it breaks out into 2 parts. He talks about what God is going to do in the present, and then he's going to talk about in the end of the chapter what God is going to do in the future. That's the break. And it happens there between 10 and 11. At the present time, God is being faithful to his people by saving a remnant. That is how we know that God is fulfilling his promise to Israel. He's saving that remnant. By the way, that's a remnant of a star. I think that's why I put that in there. God is bringing to salvation his people, but it is only a few of his people. And that's something that he has always done. And he's always talked about that remnant. And Paul brings that to these people's minds. But in the future, now today he's saving the remnant, but in the future he promises to save all of Israel. Now what that means we're going to discuss next week. I haven't come to a conclusion yet. But I'm working on it. I'm working on it. The center of this first paragraph is verse 5, which says, so too, at the present time, again, that's that present idea, there is a remnant chosen by grace. So Paul has said, this is what God has done in the past. Now he's going to say what he's doing in the present, and he's going to talk about what God is going to do in the future next week. And so we look at this paragraph today, and we see that God's faithfulness is seen in this remnant idea. And if God is faithful to this group, God has promised to be faithful to this group, and we can know that God is faithful to us as well. He starts off by asking, did God reject his people? No, God did not reject his people. Now, Paul has claimed that the Jews have stumbled over Christ. He has claimed that they have willfully turned away from God's righteousness. But does that mean that they have forfeited all claim to what God has said? No. They have not forfeited every claim to God's promises. And he says, by no means. By no means is that dog going to get that ice cream. They're just, well, at the Bailey's house maybe. But by no means are the Jews going to forfeit their promises. And then he follows that idea up with a very solemn assurance. He says, God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. He chose them. From before the foundations of the world, before they had done anything good or bad, he chose them, and he is not going to reject his people. Now again, most of the time that Paul uses that word foreknow, he means to choose to have a relationship with. In Amos, God chose his people, in Israel, in a very special way. In Amos, he says, you only have I chosen, have I known from all the people of the earth. Only the Israelites were in that machine and the claw comes down. Did you watch Toy Story? Okay. For those of you who haven't, I'm sorry. These little goomers here are in one of those machines that you find in like Village Inn, where you have put in a quarter and the claw comes down and you grab somebody, and then they go home with a very special child. That's just what God did. He sent down his claw. He got us. He says, you only have I chosen. And literally the word means no. The word is no. Of all the families on the earth. Does that mean that God doesn't know everybody? No. It means he has chosen them to have a relationship with them. They are his very special people. The evidence for that in the present time is that remnant idea. God has always kept a remnant. He has always been faithful to that remnant who believes, and God will continue to be faithful to that remnant. Now, he leads up to that point that occurs in verse 5 with some preliminary points. He's going to prove this. And the first thing that he says that God has not rejected is because he is an Israelite. He is from the tribe of Benjamin. He is a Jew who is also a Christian. And he uses himself as an example that God has not rejected the Jews because God has not rejected him. He has become a believer, and other Jews can as well. Paul wants to remind them that he is both Jew and Gentile, Jew and believer, and that God is still choosing a remnant to follow after him. Now in verses, the end of 2 and 3 and 4, Paul lays another ground for his belief in this remnant, and that's the idea of Elijah. Elijah was the first of the prophets, and maybe the greatest. The story he's referring to is in 1 Kings chapter 19, where Elijah goes up against the prophets of Baal. The prophets of Baal lose their battle. God just comes down and sets fire to Elijah's sacrifice. The prophets of Baal are killed. Jezebel gets really angry, chases Elijah into the desert. Elijah gets really depressed. Elijah goes to the Lord and says, why don't you just kill me because I'm the only one left. You have not been faithful. God says, oh yeah, I'm still at work. there are 7,000 who have